Okay, this is from Michael Handel, Masters of War, Classical Strategic Thought, 3rd Revised and Expanded Edition. It's from the chapter, The Definition of War. So despite his reputation to the contrary, Clausewitz was aware, perhaps more than any other military thinker, that war is only one of the means, and not even an independent one, of achieving one's objectives when all else has failed. He defines war precisely in this context. So Clausewitz said, war is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. And then again he says in another part of On War, war is a clash between major interests, which is resolved by bloodshed. That is the only way in which it differs from other conflicts. And then again in another part of On War, he wrote, essentially war is fighting, for fighting is the only principle in the manifold activities generally designated as war. For Clausewitz's other definitions, see another part of the book here. While Sun Tzu is primarily concerned with the conduct of war on the highest strategic level, Clausewitz focuses on the lower strategic operational levels. What can be misleading is the fact that Clausewitz, who is best known for his ideas on the primacy of politics, actually devotes relatively little space, 2 out of 8 books in On War, to the analysis of war on its highest level. The diplomatic or economic environment in which war takes place is just not within the scope of On War. For Clausewitz as military leader, the environment within which he must strive for victory is a given. In this sense, it is therefore inappropriate to compare these two treatises on identical terms. Clausewitz has also been accused of disregarding the economic and logistical dimensions of war. This criticism is not without merit, since logistics and economics are inextricably linked to strategy in war. Nevertheless, one must remember that Clausewitz, as mentioned earlier, confines his discussion to the conduct of war on the battlefield and takes the necessary economic and logistical support for granted. According to Clausewitz, it is possible, even advisable, to distinguish between the preparatory phases and the combat and operational phases of warfare. So he wrote, we clearly see that the activities characteristic of war may be split into 2 main categories, those that are merely preparations for war and war proper. The same distinction must be made in theory as well. The knowledge and skills involved in the preparations will be concerned with the creation, training, and maintenance of the fighting forces. The theory of war proper, on the other hand, is concerned with the use of these means once they have been developed for the purposes of war. All that it requires from the first group is the end product, an understanding of their main characteristics. That is what we call the art of war in a narrower sense, or the theory of the conduct of war, or the theory of the use of the fighting forces. For our purposes, they all mean the same thing. That narrower theory then deals with the engagement, with fighting itself, and treats such matters as marches, camps, and billets as conditions that may be more or less identical with it. It does not comprise questions of supply, but will take these into account on the basis as other given factors. This is still Clausewitz writing. He goes on, the art of war in the narrower sense must now, in its turn, be broken down into tactics and strategy. First is concerned with the form of the individual engagement, the second its use. So back to Handel here. In the context here, it is instructive to compare Clausewitz's and Jomini's definitions of strategy. From a modern perspective, both would appear to describe more of what would today be considered the higher operational level of warfare rather than the strategic. Clausewitz states, strategy is the use of the engagement for the purpose of the war. The strategist must therefore define an aim for the entire operational side of the war that will be in accordance with its purpose. In other words, he will draft the plan of the war, and the aim will determine the series of actions intended to achieve it. He will in fact shape the individual campaigns, and within these decide on the individual engagements, since most of these matters have to be based on assumptions that may not prove correct, while other more detailed orders cannot be determined in advance at all. It follows that the strategist must go on the campaign itself. Detailed orders can then be given on the spot, allowing the general plan to be adjusted to the modifications that are continuously required. The strategist, in short, must maintain control throughout. Jomini defines strategy in these words. Strategy is the art of making war upon the map and comprehends the whole theater of operations. grand tactics is the art of posting troops upon the battlefield according to the accidents of the ground, or bringing them into action, and the art of fighting upon the ground is contradistinction to planning upon a map. Its operations may extend over a field of 10 or 12 miles in extent. Strategy decides where to act. Grand tactics decides the manner of execution and the employment of the troops. So back to Handel here. That Jomini's conception of strategy is what we would now classify as the operational level of warfare is made clear by another position later in the book. So back to Jomini here. Strategy, as has already been explained, is the art of bringing the greatest part of the forces of an army upon the important point of the theater of war or the zone of operations. Back to Handel. Concepts of the different levels of war have changed over the years in response to advances in weapons technology and communications. That is, the appearance of longer-range weaponry, particularly air power, which can extend the war well beyond the front lines, and improved communications that permit direct real-time control over events on the front far behind the combat zone. As war became more industrialized, factors such as the mobilization of all natural resources, research and production, and diplomacy, as well as the simultaneous direction of war on many fronts, were increasingly seen as part of strategy. Sun Tzu, on the other hand, views the political, diplomatic, and logistical preparations for war and the fighting itself as integral parts of the same activity. Consequently, he devotes as much attention to the environment in which war unfolds as to the battle proper. Clausewitz's more limited definition explains in part why it was so easy for his followers to forget that war is the continuation of politics by other means. By drawing an arguably artificial distinction, Clausewitz tends to overemphasize the centrality of combat at the expense of political preparations. His assumption that the logistical or economic dimensions of war would somehow take care of themselves, or the implication, as some of his adherents thought, that economic imperatives can be outflanked by victory on the battlefield, is indeed dangerous, as the Germans discovered in the First and Second World Wars. This narrow definition is even more misleading today, when technological innovation and scientific discoveries, as well as the production and distribution of fuel, food, weapons, and ammunition, are as crucial as one's performance on the battlefield. In this respect, Sun Tzu's, or even Jomini's, comprehensive framework for the analysis of strategy and war is much more relevant to our own time than that of Clausewitz. Consequences of the different levels of analysis used by Sun Tzu on the one hand and Clausewitz and Jomini on the other are best illustrated in their attempts to identify the key objectives for the most decisive defeat of the enemy.